TeachCloud's webinar on supporting children with additional needs. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Wendy Oke. I'm the founder of TeachCloud's management app for early childhood settings used by thousands of educators and parents every day. We've been running free webinars and training sessions for educators to support them during COVID. And I think this topic is going to be one of my favorites so far. If you own or manage a preschool, TeachCloud offers a suite of benefits such as communication with parents, child observations, accident forms, staff rotas, and much more. And we also have some resources for everyone. Most of them are free and they're in the chat box. So that includes a 10% discount to use TeachCloud's communication and compliance platform. So the second resource we've made available is Cloud Academy. And during this webinar, you will hear about supporting children with additional needs, the impact of trauma, and many other topics. Many of these topics are also covered on Cloud Academy, which is a free and subsidized e-learning platform for anyone working with young children. And there are master classes on everything from supporting children with trauma to guiding children's behavior. The last thing I'll say before we start is the webinar will be recorded and sent to everyone. We had over 450 people register, but everyone, whether you attended or registered, you'll get the recording, and that's available on teachcloud.com/webinars. So with that being said, let's begin. So welcome to TeachCloud's webinar on supporting children with additional needs. Again, we are so excited to have our three guests, Hayley Rice, founder of Hayley Rice Play Therapy, James Malloy, author of Wednesday's Child, and Sarah Kelly, founder of Speak Easy Speech and Language Therapy. So I'll invite our panel to introduce themselves. So let's begin with Hayley Rice, founder of Hayley Rice Play Therapy.
Thanks, Wendy, for the introduction, and hello to the other panelists as well. I'm delighted to be here on such an important and interesting topic. Myself, I'm a psychotherapist and I specialize in play therapy. And before that, I spent 10 years in the primary school classroom. So I was a teacher for 10 years and I spend most of my time in infant classrooms. So I'm excited to speak to you guys tonight. I did do my master's research on ASD and neurodiversity, looking at how play can help children specifically with language. So I'd love to bring my teaching experience and my therapist experience to the discussion tonight.
Thanks so much for that, Hayley. And we'll be delving, I'm sure, deep into some of that research and also your experience. I mean, you're now experienced and working in the field for a number of years. So thanks for that. So we'll now move on to James Malloy, who's author of Wednesday's Child. And just before James goes, I just want to give a bit of an introduction to Wednesday's Child, the book. So the book Wednesday's Child offers insights into the world of inequality, and be it racism, sexism, or any other form of discrimination based on how we appear on the outside. So I now invite James to give us some insight into his journey so far.
Hey, thanks, Wendy. I wrote the book Wednesday's Child after graduating from the University of Limerick with a journalism and new media degree. As you said, Wednesday's Child is mainly about equality and inequality and how we overcome these challenges and deal with them throughout our lives. And it's just something that I'm very passionate about.
And James, well, I'm actually really excited to talk to you because I think you're also coming from the point of view as somebody living with additional need. Obviously, you were a child at one stage. So I'm going to be really asking you about your own experience and then just what you wish that your educators had known when you were growing up and anything else you want to share with us. I think it's always great to actually hear from the community. Sometimes we can kind of talk about the community instead of getting people within that. So thank you so much for joining us today. And last but not least, we have Sarah Kelly, founder of Speak Easy Speech and Language Therapy.
And thank you for inviting me along this evening. I first started out my training as a Montessori teacher, and I went on then to do some additional training in special educational needs. And then I did my speech and language therapy. So I have got my own clinic, private practice here in Dublin. And I also run a little online store called Play Easy. And I suppose my kind of specialism is early intervention. So my main area of interest is the kind of preschool age children. So
Great. I mean, that's the right age because that's what we're going to be focusing on today. But I'm sure that everything we'll say can be applied to children in general as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just want to start off with a general question, and that's, what does real inclusion in an early childhood learning environment mean to you? And I'd like to start off with James on this point.
So my answer to that would be that I would, every child has to be included and they have to have the opportunity to do things together. Especially people with disabilities or extra needs have to be, I suppose, catered for, but not felt like they're, I suppose, going through the trouble of being included.
Yourself, when you were growing up, can you tell us a bit about kind of your experiences? Are you a wheelchair user?
I am a wheelchair user, yeah, and I never really felt out of place until I got to school. There was, I suppose, I was kept away from the disability community for such a long time. I never actually got involved with the disability community until I was 16, and I started doing sport. Until then, it was mainly just being in the able-bodied world and not feeling like there was much of a difference between me and them. So in that respect, I think my teachers did a good job for the most part.
And what's one thing that, if you could tell the, like everyone, I think for the most part is an educator here or a parent, what's one kind of tip you would give them as someone who's actually had these lived experiences to help children? Or what was something that was done for you that helped you feel included, during your preschool or school years?
Yeah, so myself and my parents were always asked about my needs and whether I would need any additional resources to deal with mainstream education. And I think that's something that's very important, and it's not something that's universally included or yet.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I'm going to move on to our next guest, but just to say that a key point there is the communication. The parents are usually the first educator of their child. They're usually the best educator of their child, and just actually communicating with the parents, and also the child can give you so much information, like James just said. So I move on there to Sarah or Hayley, anyone that wants to come in. Just what does inclusion in an early childhood environment mean to you?
I think just to add on from James's point about, that it's included, but in a group situation, in the classroom, but I also think a bit wider. So you're very much included in that, and also the professionals. So for me, it's, I want to be involved in that as well, the interactions with the school for inclusion. And I think as well, another thing is we need to be more open to, there's been a big movement recently in the autistic community about changing the way we label these people, instead of the person with autism, it's the autistic person. And that's because we're opening up more to have conversations with these people. So I think it's a big education piece on our part and speaking to those people rather than assuming we know what inclusion means for them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And just what we were alluding to at the start, it's that communication sometimes we can talk about instead of with. They're the experts, they're the ones with the lived experiences. So that's a great point. And it's something that's easy. You can use an app, you can get the parents in, the children, look at their needs, look at their interests. But it might seem easy, but at the same time, it's actually quite hard to implement properly. So thanks so much for that. And Hayley, do you have any kind of points on what inclusion means to you?
Yeah, I think it's such a broad term. I love what James and Sarah have added. For me, my work is all around feelings and helping children through difficult feelings. So I just think of, okay, how can we include this child to make sure they feel good about themselves and they feel capable, they feel supported, they feel included. It's more than just, doing. It's that they feel it in their body and they know, And this is for any child with any need, like what I would have taught children who maybe couldn't sit still very well, or we all know that kid in the class that is up and out, and for them to know on my bad day, teacher can accommodate me. On my day when my feelings have gotten out of control or too big, I'm not a burden, as James mentioned. You know, I can be accommodated here, and there's no shame around anything. So they feel really, really included, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think that's very important because it is about the feeling. You know, we talk about in early childhood education, the hidden curriculum. Children are very good at feeling and seeing what's around them. So you might be, you know, hi, how are you? But inside you're like, oh my God, she's always running around. I can't keep her still. They can feel that energy. So it's actually looking at, why am I feeling this way? What do I need to change in my mindset? Because then the children are going to feel, you know, that they're included. And it's about that identity and belonging. So thanks so much for that, Hayley. And I know that was a broad question, but it was broad to enable us to kind of dig a bit deeper. So my second question now is, what do you think are the common pitfalls that you see when it comes to supporting children with additional needs? It's a big question, and I'm going to go to Sarah first because she nodded and smiled like, don't come to me first. So
it is a hard question. And I think, you know, there are so many barriers that are out with control, you know, teachers and availability and resources and things like that. I think one of the things that's really important is, you know, for a lot of the children I work with, their difficulties can be what we call invisible. And some of those children can fade a little bit into the background at some time. So one of the big things for me, and it's obviously, Wendy, what your Teach Cloud allows, is that kind of communication between home and school. You know, so even if a child doesn't have the language to participate in circle time, that their parents can send in a brief or a picture of something they've done at the weekend to support that. And vice versa, you know, those pictures coming home are so useful, you know. So I've got two boys. One of my boys was in a preschool setting where we did have an app and the other one wasn't, and the difference between that for me has been huge. And visuals for me, like, it's something that kind of comes up as a barrier often. It can be time consuming. I think there's ways to make visuals easier, and I think we all children need visuals regardless of where they're at. I think it can really support them. So that's just, that comes to the top of my mind immediately.
Yeah, no, I think great points, and it is a hard question. So I think you did well for going first. Hayley, James, do you want to come in there?
I think, like Sarah briefly mentioned, resourcing and resources, and without getting into it, that is probably a huge downfall in the system at the moment, that we don't have enough of, or we don't have access to, and waiting lists and all of that. But I think additionally to that, like, you know, for me, it's maybe if there is a child, like, for example, a child needs or really works well with a fidget. Some of the children I work with, what I'm hearing back is that, you know, they're not allowed to have it in the classroom. And I can understand that from a teacher's point of view as well. And I was definitely, when I was teaching, I suppose I felt like if everybody was sitting still and quiet, that meant they were learning. And that meant I had a good control of the class, and I felt good about, like, if principal walked in, I was like, look, you know, this looks good. But actually a pitfall is that belief that that's still there. Like, actually, we know from research and from brain science and everything that movement and, you know, being able to do what your body is telling you it needs to do when you're learning helps you to learn. So I think that mindset shifting, I had a little boy in my class, and I'll never forget him because he taught me so much about this. He worked really well under the table, mainly lying down and kind of rolling. And for me, it was like, oh, like, it was just activating just sit on your chair. That's all I wanted him to do. But that wasn't how he worked. And, you know, I learned how to work with him, and under the table was absolutely fine in the end. It was safe. He was getting his work done. So I think, yeah, maybe that little bit of more research and understanding and learning for teachers, that they can really trust the child if they're telling them, I need to move, or I need to have a break, or my body needs something, that we trust children more.
That's a really great point. And there's actually a really good TED talk by Ken Robinson, and he talks about how there was a child who, they labeled and they said there's something wrong, she can't sit still, and it came out that she really just wanted to be able to move and to be able to dance, and she went on to be a famous composer and director. But it's really meeting the child where they're at, as you said. So if it's under the table, meet them there. If it's outdoors, in a tree, meet them there, because whatever way you need to help them to learn, we're there to, it's not the child kind of, I guess, adapting to our environment. It's really us adapting to the child. So really great points there, Hayley. And James, do you have anything on that? Any common pitfalls that you see, or any advice that you would give to educators when working with children who have any type of additional needs?
The only thing I would say is what Hayley said there about understanding it from the perspective of the person themselves. You can listen to occupational therapists and physiotherapists and all of these people, and I don't think anything quite compares to the lived experience of the child. So I think getting their perspective is very important.
Yeah, I think that's so huge, because it doesn't matter. We have people from coming from Pakistan, and we have people from the US, we have people from Ireland, UK. It doesn't matter, kind of where you're coming from. The voice of the child is always so important. If you can hear the child, understand what they're saying, and then actually implement that, I feel like you're 98% of the way. Maybe the other 2% is getting the parents on board. But yeah, really great points there from everyone.
James's point about, their experience is so important, but I think if there's a child whose language isn't where it's at, there's lots of ways we can move around that with things like talking mats. So you can use like a visual scale. So just for that not to be a barrier, if the child hasn't got a huge amount of language, there's still plenty of ways around getting their feedback on, I don't know what, how they're settling in, where they're sitting, any of those kind of things. There's lots of ways around that with visuals.
And Sarah, just to pick up on that point, what would you say? I know that, especially in places like Ireland, the UK, the US, there's huge waiting lists to see speech and language therapists. I was talking to one family that had been on a waiting list for 3 years, and this was a number of years ago. I know hopefully it has gotten better, but with COVID and everything else. So for an educator that is in a preschool, maybe with a child who is nonverbal, maybe with a child who they know needs some kind of extra support with speech and language, what is some kind of maybe techniques or strategies, other than actually going to speech and language therapy, maybe they're on a waiting list, that they can implement today or right now?
Big things is finding the child's motivators. So what are they interested in, be it movement, be it, and then try and work in, meeting their needs in whatever way. So following their lead, first of all, and then try and use visuals to utilize that. So for example, a visual schedule in the classroom, whether it's I actually brought examples because I thought it would be helpful, like a first then board that you could use, so that you'd be doing just to help a child even transition in and out of the classroom. First we're gonna have our snack, then we're going out into the garden or whatever like that. You don't need to be fancy. We would use a lot in the clinic, whiteboard like this. And another thing I often say to parents is, take pictures when you're out and about and create a favorites album in your phone. So if you're finding it hard to transition a child, home or whatever it is, that you can show them a picture. And I just think that visuals are such a useful way, because often for children who are nonverbal, their day is not that it's planned for them, but they're just being, brought here, there and everywhere, and they might be following it no problem. But do they have an understanding, and can you factor in a choice? And I think that could be quite nice, the first, I often use this as a kind of a motivator. So first it's whatever there is, and then they can choose their them, so that they're involved in that choosing. And if you find that a child is not at the visual level and you're not really sure, take it back to objects, have a bag of objects for choices. So I really think that we all need visuals. And I just think if there's one take home message for me personally, it would be visuals. They're just so useful. And there's lots of fun ways. Like I've even, like a lot of my kids, like a movement break, and I've made this dice for them, and they can roll the dice, and that they can do, you know, a dance, they can go on the wobble board, they can go on they do the suckers, they can go on the trampoline. So I just think visuals for me are huge.
Sarah, it was a very hard question, but I think you really summarized that.
It's
really
hard.
well.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard.
And I would just want to reiterate the importance of first then. In one of our free courses on Cloud Academy, it's on guiding children's behaviour, but it's on all types of behaviour, whether it's because of, you know, an additional need or whatever else. And the first then is one of our recommendations, and it's so easy to create. You're literally just writing it and you're laminating it.
You can't take away from a whiteboard. We're trying to use, I'm not the best with drawing. I'm trying to use it more and more in the clinic for parents to see, because children don't care, but it's amazing as soon as you start to draw on a whiteboard, children generally attend. Like a lot of our kids are quite visual in their learning, and when they do quite like it, or even sometimes I'll let the child attempt to draw on what they want to do as their choice. But I do think visuals are so important, really, really do.
Really agree with everything Sarah said, and I suppose like the importance of the communication and like factoring in what the child needs and getting that feedback from them. But that also leads to, well, in my research anyway, where if a child isn't able to communicate and they're feeling, it's frustration, isn't it? And then that's when you see the behavior and the anger and other things spilling kind of out, because they haven't had their voice, they can't articulate or whatever. So it has a knock-on effect, doesn't it, when if a child isn't able to communicate on their esteem even and their feelings. So it's all connected.
And I'm just going to stick with that, Hayley. On our last webinar, I said the same thing, but I believe that all behavior is communication. So whatever the child is doing, they are trying to communicate something to you. And oftentimes they're relationship seeking. And I help a child who has very limited verbal communication, who is pushing and pinching others in the class. He's waiting for assessment, so we have no advice from therapists as yet.
The job of teaching is so hard, because you've got all these different needs and different learning, and then you've got this regulation, dysregulation coming in. So for me, it's always, yes, behaviors of communication. What's he trying to communicate? Is there frustration there? What's underpinning it? So has this child come from a background where maybe he didn't have his breakfast, or maybe he doesn't have a connection relationship at home? What has happened in the house? What's he bringing in? And then he's needing to touch, he's needing to, you know, do something. So that's a clue. He's given us a clue with his body. I need to have some feedback, maybe I need to touch out. How can we replace that? So I love using the ACT model: acknowledge the feeling, communicate the boundary, and target the alternative. So saying things like, oh, you're feeling like you want to hit, I won't let you hurt, you can instead. So he has something to do this movement with to get it out of his body, but he knows that the boundary is very clear, and I'm not. And it's limited language. You can even could really do that by like in a sign way, that it's just a very clear, I can see that you're whatever, but I'm not letting you do that, and redirecting. But there's loads of clues in that. I always think like children are so clever. Not only do they communicate through, you know, their feelings, through their behavior, but they give us clues about what their body needs all the time. And you know, from kids who are jumping up and down, or kids who are, you know, slamming into people, there's something going on there. And looking at what might be underpinning it, is there, it can be anything from like that, the lack of connection, to like kids looking for that, I can't communicate, I can't talk to my peers, but I want to connect, and I don't know how to connect with them. I don't know how to say, hey, do you want to play? So instead I'm pushing. So that's like that, you know, I can understand why he would do that if he wants to play and he doesn't know how to. So instead he does this simple thing like hitting out, you know, if that makes sense.
And I wonder, is there a pattern to it? Like I'm wondering, is it because it's a time when it's a shared activity, and, you know, turn taking is really difficult? So, you know, trying to identify, like as Hayes said, is there a pattern? Is it when it's time to go out in the garden and there's so many children, you know, gathering together, and he feels this sensory overload, that's his way of, you know, and if that was it, maybe they'd bring that child out first. I think social stories can be really useful in situations like this when there's limited language, but I also think that kind of teaching of the skill we're looking for, you know, that so teaching gentle hands and demonstrating gentle hands and how to be gentle, and then reinforcing that language at that time. But I know it can be really different. Like for me in the clinic setting, I'm one-on-one with these children, so it's a very different environment. But then going back again to trying to a social story, if that could help, about how we are kind to our friends and things like that. And I think you'll probably find templates if you Google social stories online, and putting pictures of the child in there to make it really meaningful for them and their school and their peers. And then just seeing if there's anything around that you can identify. Is it a busy time in the classroom? Is it before snack and they're hungry? Or is it, and if it's a shared interaction thing, can you step that down and try and do a turn taking game with 2 children and build that up until they can tolerate a group session more? I suppose without more information, it can be hard to an idea.
Yeah, and I just want to come in there and say, I think from Sarah and Hayley, just even summarizing that, I think a lot of times we have to also start with what is the function of the behavior. And I think that's kind of what they're saying there. Is it relationship seeking? Is it at a certain time that they want to escape a specific activity, that they're engaging in behaviors that concern? We just kind of need to understand what is the function, because then if we understand what they're trying to get, then we can like Hayley was saying, we can look at some type of an alternative or connect and then redirect, right? And again, all of what I'm saying is part of our free course on guiding children's behavior. We do list out a number, because it can be quite hard to kind of Sarah, Hayley, James, they are experts in this field, but of course, if you don't have the child in front of you, it can be quite hard to kind of start giving specific examples. But that course really gives you kind of overview examples, and you can apply it to your specific children. So I don't want to get like into any kind of diagnosis. Yes. But I think it's good just to talk about that. What is the function of behavior on that point? So just to move on, and James, I just want to kind of drag you in here. You've been listening to us like really attentively, but just an example just from your book, and that's available. I was just looking at it. You can order it. I was looking at the Apple Store, and it's available there, the book Wednesday's Child. It really talks about your own journey as growing up with a disability. So can you tell us maybe anything from the book, like a story that you wish everyone knew, or something that really impacted you as a wheelchair user or with additional needs?
Yeah, so back when I was in school, I suppose something that was that did affect me was I suppose not getting to go on field trips, say, with my peers, because there was no, talking or getting to know anybody inside the classroom. And a lot of that was done on field trips. And I suppose there wasn't the budget to just get one wheelchair accessible bus for me. But the thing that I found strange as well is that I was always given a permission slip to sign and bring home. So yeah, I'd say if there was anything that I wish was different, it was that. I could have gone and formed bonds, not being left, isolated on my own back in the school.
Wow, again, just hearing from that lived experience. Thanks for sharing that, James. And like I was saying, the book is available. And James, what prompted you to actually write about your own experience? Like, what was kind of the one thing that you wanted people to know about your experience that might maybe help a child or an adult in a similar situation, or maybe a parent or an educator?
So I wanted people who hadn't lived through the experience to have a better understanding, and I suppose to get to grips with how we can overlook a lot of the things that some other people have to deal with in their daily lives that other people might not even consider.
I think that's such a great point because, we can overlook those things because we're not in that person's shoe. So educating yourself around that lived experience, and obviously within your early childhood service or school, speaking, that communication is so important, speaking to the children, trying to always understand. I always think of educators as detectives, especially when it comes to behavior, really trying to understand the child and why they're engaging in certain types of behavior is so important. And Ida is just asking there, what is the name of your book? And it is Wednesday's Child. Am I correct, James?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so Wednesday's Child is the name of the book, and I'm going to download it after this. I have the link up on Apple. But yeah, great. It's just a great insight, basically, into something that you may not ordinarily have an insight into. So I have a few other questions, but one question we're getting from Sandra Casey is, in an early childhood setting, is there cases where a mainstream setting is not suitable to meet a child with additional needs?
It's so individual to the child. And I think it can be hard to, I'm not in an education setting to know even what the criteria and things are. And I suppose it's looking at that very individually instead of having kind of a blanket rule as such. But I do think in some situations, children are better suited to other school settings. But I think the big thing for me is still having that option to spend some time. So, a lot of our mainstream schools here now will have an autism unit attached to it. And that means that the children can still, join in different aspects of the classroom for, circle time or arts and crafts or the garden or whatever it is. So I think, it is very individual, but I don't know if that's best practice necessarily, and because I think in ways, and, kind of what James is saying, we need to educate ourselves and learn more instead of then, what does that tell our children? Our children that are attending a mainstream school, well, they're different and they're in that situation. So I'm not sure if that's the best practice and necessarily.
The kind of individual needs of the child. Hayley, James, do you want to come in on any of those?
It's a really hard one, isn't it? And it's so individual, but it's that that kind of I suppose that fine line between, are we going for inclusion, like real inclusion, like everybody has a place in mainstream, or would a child actually do better, have more attention, have better services or facilities and thrive in another setting? So I don't know the answer to that, but it's I wonder what feels right to me is like that, we can include everybody, but maybe sometimes actually we can't because there's 35 in a class and there's no space in the unit, or there's not an SNA in that classroom. And so I don't know, it's really hard, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, it is really hard because and that was kind of the answer, it really depends on the individual child. Another question that's coming in there is, how would you approach play with a child who is nonverbal and maybe gives little eye contact?
I can answer for that because I do that every day. That's part of my work, and I'm sure Sarah as well. Play for me with children who are nonverbal, it's just the same as play with children who are verbal, and it's finding their interests, being led by the child, being guided by what motivates them, what they like. I'm not going to sit and try and play dollies with a little boy who's mad about Spider-Man. I'm going to play Spider-Man. And it's also often about short bursts, intensive interaction, managing our expectations. And if a child's play skills are limited, then you're looking at having little short bursts frequently to build their play skills and help them along. So that's going to help them to communicate. So they're communicating through play, and all their nonverbal communication will come in. So I think the child is your best guide, and go with that.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Sarah, do you want to add anything to that? Or
I think I completely agree with Hayley. I think play can, or what we think is play may not be play for every child. So some children like movement as their type of play, and it's about meeting them where they're at. And then the little eye contact, it's not really about, it's more for me about that back and forth interaction rather than the eye contact. Like, so that's that reciprocalness, and that's what we need for communication back and forth. And so like how I'd approach play for a nonverbal child is I would generally set out a few different types of activities, and I would see what that child gravitated towards, and then see if I can notice anything that they're interested in. So some kids will like, you know, maybe tipping things out and posting things back in. So I'll try and create a whole session based on that, and then see if they'll tolerate me joining in their play, and then see if we can get that back and forth. But I think it's very much, as Hayley said, following their interest and their lead. And again, I know that can be hard in a kind of a classroom setting, but observation is really, really key in these situations. Take the time to observe them first and see if you can find anything that captures their interest. Another thing to think about is some children are more auditory stimulated, so they like noisy toys, whether it's musical instruments. Some children will like visual things, so they might like things dropping or bits of tinsel, or, you know, your parachute. So again, looking at, or do they like things that give them feedback in their hands? So, you know, a ball that's bumpy rather than a ball that's smooth. So again, just looking at all that sensory information and their senses, and see if that gives you any information as well.
Yeah, I think that they're really great points there, and the point of observing the child as well. You know, on Teach Cloud we have the learning stories where you're writing down what the child is doing. A lot of times just observing them, even if you don't think they're playing, just observing them, what are they doing? You'll actually find that when you look back at that, you can see patterns. Just like what Sarah was saying, maybe they're more interested in noisy sounds, or maybe they were actually quite like trains. It seems simple, but it makes a huge difference. But from actually observing the child, and again, based on the individual needs and abilities of that child, you will get the the answer. Within a mainstream setting, is there anything that we can do to help the other children understand the needs of the child with ASA?
I would say that it would come down to representation, and having more positive role models, especially within the media, whether that's taking out a film or reading a book with a realistic person with additional needs or a disability, and getting children, and it starts with children really, doesn't it? Getting them used to having stories and films and everything like that read to them, and having them watch other people with differences.
James, I think that's a really great point, because sometimes GermanSparks, if you can Google her, but she is a huge kind of anti-bias advocator, and she has kind of like a model where you can actually look around your early childhood setting or your school and look at the type of materials that you're actually offering. Sometimes you'll notice that all the dolls look a certain way, and there are actually dolls that you can buy, like there's dolls in wheels, so many different types of dolls or learning materials and books on so many topics that you can buy to make the actual learning environment as diverse as possible. Because even if you don't have a child with an additional need, when children go out of the preschool or just in the world, they're going to meet all types of people. So I think that's a really great point, James. And I'm going to go to Hayley. So within a mainstream setting, is there anything that we can do to help the other children understand the needs of the child with additional needs, or to stop negative perceptions?
For the teachers and for myself, it was about modeling that inclusivity of everybody, and just like that, if a child was wiggling under the table, that I wasn't going, oh, you can't sit down, because that's saying you're different, something wrong because you can't sit. Look at everybody else, they're all sitting and you can't. So if I had have been doing that kind of language, it would have been sending that message of like, difference is bad, or we have to all be the same, or, you know. So there's a lot that a teacher can model and kind of even say out loud if something is said in the classroom. And then like that, bring in the toys, the different materials, the books, that it's a part of the atmosphere. It's the ethos in the classroom.
I agree with James. I think it's kind of that, you know, it's top-down approach. But I also think as well, and I don't know if James would agree, but I think children are naturally inquisitive, and I think we often stop that by saying, oh, don't say anything, don't say anything, instead of what's the problem with a child going up to somebody like James and asking him about it, because that gives his a voice, instead of us saying, oh, no, don't, no, I'll, you know, they kind of shush them. I don't know, James, that maybe that you wouldn't be comfortable with that, but I would think that would make it more open.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Well, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, and I put some resources there in the chat, and somebody was just asking about GermanSparks. That's really kind of what the whole anti-bias education is about, is actually asking those challenging questions, because sometimes we shy away from them, and then, like you said, we shush children up and then think, oh my God, there's something wrong, so I can't ask that question, or I have to be afraid of this person. Whereas if it's an open conversation, and they feel that they can ask those questions, and then you're answering it with an informed response, and it's not all the time that you're going to have the answer straight away to the child's question, but it might be a case of you note that the child has said something. Oh, for example, I don't want to play with him because he looks a certain way, or I don't want to play with her. When I was doing placement in early childhood service, I heard someone say, I don't want to play with them because of their eyes are a certain shape, and then we had to go back and start looking at, well, actually, there's lots of different eye colors, there's lots of different eye shapes, but we spent a little bit of time as a team actually going through that and then bringing it into a learning opportunity into the service. So sometimes as educators, we can put a lot of pressure to know the answer straight away. Sometimes you might actually have to go away, think about it for an hour, a day, maybe a week, and then come back and use that as a learning opportunity for the children. But GermanSparks, the links are there to do an actual audit, an anti-bias audit of your early childhood service. That includes children with additional needs, racism, discrimination, bias, and so on. And it's a free audit. And then there's also a diversity and equality masterclass for educators and for parents as well in the chat. How do you think that educators can support children who have experienced something traumatic in their lives? Maybe they're finding it hard to regulate their emotions, or that this child is maybe in the foster care system or has gone through some type of adverse childhood experience.
I can answer that from a therapist point of view. Sorry, I think there's not a classroom in the country or a preschool in the country that doesn't have a child in the classroom with some sort of trauma, because we think of trauma as like a big event, but actually sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just not having enough connection each day, or not having that warm, safe home. So there's a lot of invisible trauma, and then it maybe shows up as the child acting out in the classroom. So for me, whenever I speak to teachers and parents about this, and I do any webinars or anything, I think, like, coming from a place of curiosity when you see behavior, being an observer, as Sarah mentioned earlier, and having that compassion and empathy for children, that they're being aware that there might be something going on at home or not going on at home that's causing. And I think every child at the moment going through COVID, being told, you're safe in school, you can go in, then actually, no, you're not safe, you must stay at home. No, you're safe in school, you can go back in. And they have this kind of lack of trust, and that's traumatic. So every child is going through and has these like little T traumas at the moment. So really being informed about the nervous system and regulation, being a good co-regulator, teacher and any staff in the classroom or in the preschool, you're a co-regulator to the 20 nervous systems, whether you like it or not. They're trying to mirror and co-regulate with you all day long. So I love as well telling parents and teachers that we have mirror neurons at the front of our brain, and children will mirror us. So if a child is out of sorts or is upset or is angry, when we attune to them and we connect, we take a deep breath, they will take a deep breath. If you soften your face and you keep your face like safe instead of angry, they'll feel safe. So anything to do with trauma comes down to safety, co-regulation, and then just having compassion for it, I think.
I would say try to make sure in all instances that we can include people with additional needs in everything we do. I would say if somebody with a disability goes on a field trip, try to make sure it's something that they can be included in and not have to maybe sit beside the teacher. Make the activity inclusive, and just I suppose try our best not to let people go through prolonged periods of time in isolation, because that can be very damaging.
I think what rings true for me from this conversation and hearing everybody is listen to the child, tune in to the child and be guided by them, whether it's when you're playing, when you're looking for clues about what they're doing, or whether it's like, how can they be included? How can we do more for them? Ask them, and be guided by the child and really tune in to what they're feeling, and know as well that how they get on in the classroom and how they're included or they're not will really impact their sense of self and their esteem. So it should be like a priority. Yeah.
So on that.
Oh yeah, yeah, I can chip in. I suppose, I think one of the big things is that we often get fixated on, not fixated, but it's the big topic for parents, for educators, is the spoken word. And communication is 85% nonverbal. So there's so much more to communication than using words. And I suppose it's what I call the tip of the iceberg skill. It's the most visible thing, but try and think more broadly about communication and interaction and not just the spoken word. So yeah. And just, I might actually send on a link, but I do, now I have a little online shop that I do. So just to plug it a little bit shamelessly, but I create resources and kind of like what I call play easy boxes for supporting language. And I accompany them with a booklet. And I have a few other things on the go, but they're always kind of limited editions. So there's not always stock there, but I'm always coming up with new things. So you can check out it's on my website or my Instagram.
Thank you for joining Teach Cloud's webinar on supporting children with additional needs in your preschool. If you have any questions, email hello@teachcloud.com. Don't forget, you can also book a demo for Teach Cloud's nursery, daycare, and childcare management and compliance app on teachcloud.com.